So we're going to be going over a very interesting article about cancel culture. However, I might hear you say, "But, Bowler Hatman, you said you don't talk about, cultural issues. These, the changing culture and stuff like that." Yeah, I don't. But I think this article makes a fantastic point, and I think it's a point that needs to be repeated very, very often. For you see, cancel culture, when you look at it historically, as we are going to do today, cancel culture has never come from the left. It has always been very much, traditionally, a right-wing calling point. So today we're going to go over an article from The Guardian just on that and why this cancel culture is not the domain of the left, but it's really a right-wing thing. So before we dive into that, please do remember to hit that like and share button, and of course down below there is a link to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link should you like to support me that way, and thank you very much to the people that do. So on into the article. So as I said, this comes from The Guardian, and the title is "Cancel Culture is not the preserve of the left. Just ask our historians." This will be a year of disillusionment. Even with the rollout of new vaccines and the potential end of the pandemic will not prevent that. The first moment of disillusionment will come the moment we realise that we are still going to be talking about Brexit and still negotiating our future relationship with the EU, particularly around the service sector. As 2020 demonstrated, getting Brexit done doesn't actually mean it's done. And for those who believe in the more utopian of the many false promises contained within the original Brexit prospectus, the disillusionment will be deeper, although few will be willing to acknowledge it. As through the Brexit wardrobe lies our new age of difficult choices and cold realities, rather than some enhanced sovereignty or Empire 2.0 Narnia. For the government and its cheerleaders, growing disillusionment will bring with it another challenge, because among the many problems that follow the vanquishing of an imaginary enemy is that there is no one left to blame. What happens now the finger of blame can no longer be pointed at Brussels bureaucrats? What will fill the papers now the stories of bendy bananas are now off the agenda? Who can be vilified when immigration is not reduced to a trickle? Lost industries do not return, and Britannia fails to be re-emerge as a buccaneering and unchained onto the world stage. Will many of the damaging effects of Brexit will be slow to emerge, and others will be blamed on the pandemic. Eventually, though, the day will dawn on which it is widely recognised that the buck stops at Westminster, not Brussels. Then what? In the second half of 2020, one strategy for filling the post-Brexit blame vacuum was tried and tested and war-gamed, all of it executed with levels of proactive, forward-thinking and strategic planning that the government struggled to muster when dealing with the new pandemic. New enemies were identified and the attack lines against them fine-tuned in focus groups. And finally, in the crosshairs are the black and brown working class people, who are to be stripped of their class identity so that their interests and their histories can be falsely presented as dangerous and a threat to those of those working class people, hence the demonstration and the deliberate mischaracterization of the Black Lives Matter movement. Among the new enemies are academics and in particular historians whose work focus on the histories of empire and slavery. They and their institutions have commissioned research from them and have been subjected to a new order of hostility and expect to see more of the same in 2021. Such strategies are a tactic by which it is hoped some of the more anger and resentment that was carefully cultivated over decades and targeted at Brussels can now be redirected at enemies within. The name of the game is distraction, but also coalition for those disillusioned by the realities of Brexit Britain. And there is more to it. The government and its supporters also aim to set themselves up as the defenders of British institutions and the champions of British history in order to stake a claim to those titles that they were willing to trash. They were only just too willing to trash. To get a glimpse of 2021, take a look back at the second half of 2020. In August, the British Museum was denounced for adding information and gathering new artifacts around its bust of Hans Sloane in order to contextualize rather than merely memorialize. A prolific collector who gained much of his wealth from slavery. Weeks later, the National Trust was condemned when it revealed that many of its properties came under its care have historical links to slavery or imperialism. Research projects and findings that are just a few years ago would have drawn very little public interest or attention have been presented as external threats to the nation and one vision of a national identity. The academics involved in denouncing in newspapers our enemies and are merely just doing their jobs. Attacking historians who dared to examine the role of slavery or imperialism in the creation of Britain's national wealth and our culture conveniently creates new enemies who can be paraded before the people. When the historians in question turn out to be women, as was the case with the National Trust Colonial Countryside Project, the tone of the attacks becomes even more personal and hysterical. But what is under assault here is not just individuals, but academic curiosity itself, the lifeblood of scholarship that is now being portrayed as a form of cultural treason and misrepresented as political posturing. Unlike some on the left, I have never doubted that cancel culture exists, fueled by political intolerance and the toxic autonomy of social media. The great myth about cancel culture, however, is that it exists only on the left. For the past 40 years, right-wing newspapers have ceaselessly fought to delegitimize and ultimately cancel our national broadcaster, motivated by finance as well as political ambitions. Likewise, recent attacks on museums and universities and the National Trust were launched not to win arguments or influence the shape of historical debates, but to intimidate other institutions and encourage them to cancel projects they might have been considering. To investigate their own historical links to parts of Britain's past that our leaders and much of our press should feel should be even jettisoned or just left unexamined. This war is against facts, a flight from reason motivated by a cult of incuriosity. It is culturally corrosive, but also politically expedient. In the week since his death last month, the words of John Leckel have been shared endlessly on social media. One quote in particular has gained traction. Nationalism, he once said, is quite different from patriotism. For nationalism, you need enemies. The new enemies paraded before the gallows of these new culture wars are to be our fellow citizens, our cultural institutions, and even aspects of our own history. And that is the case. And I love history. I am a big history buff. And obviously, in fact, one of the reasons initially I wanted to take this channel was to start talking about history initially. Because again, I'm not, trained in history, but I love talking about history. I love reading about history books and stuff like that. So it really is a shame to see that we have a government who is willing to portray and jettison political actual history that happened and ignore it or cow it as some sort of enemy that is to be beaten and attacked upon is very, very distressing to someone who, like me, who loves history, and it should be distressing to anyone else out there who loves history. It is not wrong. All these projects that were done were not wrong in any way, shape or form. They are just true. It's a matter of fact. And as was said there, these projects, if they were done like, not in 2020 or, 2019 or 2018, no one would have batted an eyelid at them. But unfortunately, we can now see that, this is unfortunately the path that our newspapers are going to take, especially the right-wing newspapers. And thus the culture wars are going to be pretty much in effect full swing from next year. Unfortunately, that might be indeed the case. And don't worry, if I think something is worth covering, and I mean from a factual perspective, like, like the fact that the whole National Trust did a research into the fact that many of its properties had links with slavery and empire. What's the big hoop to deal about it? It doesn't damage anyone's standing. It doesn't do anything. The thing is, it's this whole nationalist bent that our government is now on. And that type of project is going to be seen as the enemy or damaging Britain. In what way does that damage Britain? The damage really was done thousands of years ago. But, or what even thousands, hundreds of years ago, shall we say now. But that's the state that our press are going to whip themselves up into a further, because, as they say, they can no longer point to the EU as the boogeyman for all Britain's problems. And, of course, they don't want to point to Boris or the Tories as the problem because, well, they're being paid by people to keep them in power. So, as a result, this is why I think that, people like myself, Max, and Phil are really going to be important going forward, because at least we're going to tell you what it's like. We're going to be honest with you and tell you most of these culture war stuff I will just not pay attention to unless, it somehow balloons into a big thing. But then at that point, it's still not policy. It's still not what's really going to affect, this country. But there you go. So, as always, please do remember to hit that like and share button on your way out. And, of course, down below there's a link to my Patreon page and one-off donation link. And thanks all for watching. We'll see you all next time.